Catherine Suits, one of our original founders of the Historical Society, going back to 1944. And Bob is also a member of our Historical Society, and he'll be doing tonight's program.
Okay. Thank you, Len. Did you have something else?
No, that's it.
Oh, okay. Good evening.
Good evening.
I used to be a member of the Esperance Presbyterian Church, and there are pictures here. And as you go in the door, on the left side, on the wall, is a big plaque for Sheldon Jackson. I'd never heard of Sheldon Jackson. So I started doing a little research. I've read about 1,000 pages. I'm just totally awed by the man and all of his accomplishments. And he grew up right over here in the town of Duanesburg. He became a worldwide figure of great renown and of great achievement. Now, I have cut and cut and cut. I don't want you to be here for 3 hours. So I will be happy to answer questions or to give any extra information, but I will get started right away. Sheldon's grandfather, the Honorable Samuel Jackson, was born in England, came to the United States around 1790, settled in Montgomery County, where he married Miss Louise Hoyer, described as an accomplished lady of American birth. Samuel's business ventures proved to be very successful, and he was called to several offices of honor and trust. He served 5 terms as a state legislator, helped plan the celebration of the Erie Canal, and he was a friend of DeWitt Clinton. So his son, Samuel Jr., has the middle name Clinton. He was a full colonel in the state infantry. For much of his life, he was called the Colonel. He died in 1845 at the age of 90. His eulogy says he was held in high esteem as a trustworthy leader and a wise counselor. The other grandfather of Sheldon Jackson was Alexander Sheldon. He was born in Suffield, Connecticut in 1766. He graduated from Yale College at the age of 20. He and his wife moved to New York, and within 13 years he was elected to the New York State Assembly, where he served several terms and was elected Speaker 5 times. In 1812, the New York College of Physicians and Surgeons licensed him. He settled in Charleston, Montgomery County, where he enjoyed a reputation as a skilled physician and a safe leader for political movements of the time. He was a regent of the New York State University, judge of the county court, and a delegate to the Convention of 1821 to revise the state's constitution. He died September 10th, 1836, only 70 years old. Our interest in him tonight is because his daughter Delia became the mother of our subject, Sheldon Jackson. Alexander died when Sheldon was only 3 years old, so he was not a great influence on Sheldon, but his last name became Sheldon's first name. Delia Sheldon married Samuel Jackson, their son, Sheldon Jackson. The Sheldons and the Jacksons lived near each other and shared many common interests. Dr. Alexander Sheldon's daughter married Sam. I just went through all that. Okay. For commercial reasons, the young family moved 10 miles. Missed. The family lived in Minaville in a house that was provided by Colonel Jackson so that his son could manage several family businesses from there. They had a store, a sawmill, a transportation business. They had 6 different businesses going on, and Samuel was in charge of running them all. He also went part-time to RPI in Troy. For commercial reasons, the young family moved 10 miles south to Esperance, which was on the Great Western Turnpike. Sheldon's sister Louise was born there. Louise and Sheldon were very close throughout their childhood. At Esperance, the family attended services at the Presbyterian Church, and on December 23rd of 1837, Delia Jackson made a public confession of faith in Christ. A few months later, her husband Samuel Clinton Jackson made his confession of faith. And on the 11th of December the next year, Delia and Samuel publicly dedicated their children to the Lord and his service. From that day forward, neither Sheldon nor his parents had any thought other than that Sheldon would be dedicated to a gospel ministry. Sheldon was 4.5 years old. A year and a half after joining the church, Sheldon's father, Samuel, was unanimously chosen the ruling elder of the congregation, a position which he filled with ability and conscientious fidelity for many years. This brought him into close interaction with wider fields of Christian work at home and abroad. He was frequently chosen as a commissioner to the General Assembly, which is the governing body of the Presbyterian Church. He was a Presbyterian of the most decided and unwavering type, but he had charity sweet enough and broad enough to recognize and approve that which was good and commendable in those of other views or denominations who might disagree with him. In the community where he was best known, as well as in other places, Mr. Jackson was honored and beloved by old and young for his gentleness of disposition, kindness of heart, and unobtrusive goodness. Around 1840, Mr. Jackson developed poor health. I don't know if there was mold in the store or something there disagreed with him. He got very ill, and they moved to the store to a farm formerly owned by Samuel Jackson Sr. Sheldon was 6 years old when they moved to the farm. The whole family liked the farm, so they stayed there after Mr. Jackson's health improved. They attended church each Sunday, even in the most severe weather. There's an account in the book here of their going 10 miles from the farm to Esperance. In those days, horse and buggy or sleigh were the best transportation. That took a long time. Very often in the winter, the sled would overturn or the horses would fall in the deep snow, and they had an awful time getting out. They had buffalo robes, and they would put the mother and the daughter on the robe and write everything. They always carried an axe so they could chop through fences and brush and so on to get to church. They would light the fires or open the doors in the summertime to ventilate the place, get everything ready. They shoveled the paths from the church all the way out to the street for the other people to come. So they were there bright and early, got everything done, and closed up afterwards, and they usually got home in time enough to milk the cows, but it was usually dark in the wintertime. They were there all day long. Mr. Jackson organized weekly prayer groups that met in people's houses and a monthly meeting of missionary board support. When Sheldon was 15, he was sent to a noted academy in Glens Falls for the 1848-49 school year. But during that year, the pastor in Esperance moved to Hayesville, Ohio, to take charge of an academy there. The Reverend Dr. Saunders Diefendorf was a friend of the Jackson family and invited Sheldon to live in his home and attend the academy at Hayesville, which had an excellent reputation. So Sheldon transferred, after 1 year in Glens Falls, to Ohio and progressed rapidly. And after only 2 years, he matriculated as a sophomore at Union College in Schenectady. It's a bright guy here. The following year, Sheldon made his personal public confession of faith. He was a no-nonsense student and said that his parents dedicating him to gospel ministry probably kept him from participating in boyhood foolishness. Sheldon was chosen to speak at graduation in the spring of 1855. The following fall, Sheldon started theological studies at Princeton University, and the following spring he was taken under the care of the Presbytery of Albany. During the summer of 1856, he sold books door to door in Albany and Montgomery counties. And that summer, he preached his first public sermon at the Dutch Reformed Church at Orisville. One woman fell asleep, but several people commended him on a job well done. The next year, 1857, Sheldon was licensed to preach and led summer worship at the Presbyterian Church in Amsterdam. Then he was appointed to a position with the, get this title, the American Systematic Beneficence Society, which allowed him to preach in any of the major cities between New York City and Leavenworth, Kansas. He went to all of them. And at one Sunday, he covered 4 churches of 4 different denominations. Sheldon was prone to overexert himself. That was his trademark. His junior year, he suffered a breakdown. His liver and his stomach caused great danger to his health. He was bedridden for several weeks. At Princeton Seminary, Jackson encountered several missionaries returning from Africa, China, India, and the South Sea. They inspired him to spread the gospel. During his senior year, word came that 8 missionaries and 600 Christians had been martyred in India. Sheldon was one among the many seminarians who were eager to replace them. He applied to the missionary board for his assignment to India or Siam. But his unromantic liver and stomach, as well as his weak eyesight, precluded any assignment abroad. His credentials were so strong that he was accepted for mission work, but only in North America. This is one of the most ironic judgments in American history. Sheldon was passionately in love with his neighbor and good Christian friend, Mary Voorhees. 3 weeks after graduation, Sheldon and Mary were married on Sheldon's 24th birthday, May 18th, 1858. The idealistic couple set off for the Choctaw Indian Reservation in what is now Spencer, Oklahoma. Within 6 months, Sheldon contracted malaria and asked Mary to take him to his parents, who had moved to Galesburg, Illinois. After his recovery, Sheldon and Mary moved to La Crescent, Minnesota, which is across the Mississippi River from La Crosse, Wisconsin. Sheldon put up a sign at the ferry terminal that Presbyterians going west should leave their names and intended destinations with the Reverend Sheldon Jackson so that proper care could be given to them. The mission board assigned Sheldon to 5 villages within 25 miles walking distance of La Crescent. Sheldon felt that his field was as far as he could reach by any means at hand. And at that time, the United States was very much a Christian nation, but the interior was being settled by people from various parts of the world and from certain social groups that did not practice Christianity. The Methodists had a policy of establishing churches in settlements. Sheldon Jackson established churches where he thought settlements should be built. He said when people arrived, they should have a church waiting for them. He started traveling everywhere he could go, from the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains, between the Canadian border and Mexico. This is no exaggeration. Every year he traveled east to report his accomplishments to the mission board and to ask them for more money and to send more ministers to care for the churches he established and that were in schools or taverns where there were not yet dedicated church buildings. Got a map here. He covered from Wisconsin all of this shaded area. He went everywhere. During the Civil War, he worked in a hospital in Tennessee and contracted typhus and almost died. Upon his recovery, he took on a pastorate in Rochester, Minnesota for 5 years, from 1864 to 1869. In 1869, he assumed the position of superintendent of the Board of Home Missions for Western Territories, and those were Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and Montana. He published a newspaper, the Rocky Mountain Presbyterian. For 12 years, he traveled throughout the Western Territories by negotiating free rides from the stagecoach lines, railroads, and river steamers. He would sometimes borrow horses and often walked great distances. He could sleep in any position in any location. He sometimes tied himself onto a horse or onto the roof of a stagecoach, and he sometimes slept on coils of rope on a ship, even if it was raining or snowing. After the Civil War, President Grant had appointed a commission to determine the causes of wars with the Indians. Their report found that whites mostly responsible for a tragic history of disregarded treaties, savage wars, and wanton massacres. Grant responded with a plan to establish peace and humanize relationships. Christian organizations, this is the plan, Christian organizations would teach agriculture and civilization pursuits. Churches and schools would lead Indians to understand and appreciate the comforts and benefits of a Christian civilization, and thus be prepared for the duties and privileges of citizenship in the United States. Cleanliness, literacy, and independence would guide them to be good citizens of the United States. The Bureau of Indian Affairs gave aid to mission schools. Federal policy leaders sought to educate as many Indian children as possible away from their tribes and villages. It was believed the children would learn faster and more thoroughly if they were not distracted by tribal languages and customs in their homes. When the children graduated and returned to their homes, they would be agents of change in their tribes. Plains Indians had been surrounded on reservations and were dependent on food provided by the United States government. Alaskan natives were economically self-sufficient in their villages. Jackson wanted the children to live in the villages where they would continue to live and work after their education, and that's all through his territory. He never espoused taking children out of their homes, although he's been accused of that. Jackson went to Alaska in 1877, and during the next 8 years he established Presbyterian mission schools in 6 communities and encouraged other denominations to establish schools as well. He lobbied Congress and several churches for funds to finance schools in Alaska. He was appointed general agent in charge of education for Alaska. Rules of the Bureau of Indian Affairs did not pertain to him because he was in the education department. So he got away with not following all the regs for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Let's see. Some mission boards disliked that Jackson was able to attract funds that the missionaries in the Southwest thought they should get. In 1885, he had an appropriation of $25,000 to cover construction of new buildings, salaries, equipment, supplies, and travel expenses for 10,000 students. That's $2.50 a student. Now, I did some research this morning, and from this time to modern times, one of their dollars is 30 of ours. And they'll be mentioning some amounts of money, and just multiply everything by 30 in your head. He got the appropriation raised to $40,000 a year from $25,000. In 1885, he opened 10 new schools. He spent $30 to $150 per student, depending on the kind of training they needed. He was more efficient than the schools on the Indian reservations in the Southwest. They were spending $170 for every student. Half of the schools were contract schools run by church missionaries that got funding help from the government. In 1894, Congress terminated funding contract schools. Federal money for religious organizations was ended. In 1885, Jackson was arrested. The charges against him were false, but there was animosity toward him from commercial interests who wanted to sell alcohol to the natives and pay them too little for their crafts to be sold, and to sell women and children as slaves. He tells, they complain, he tells everybody how to live. And he doesn't even spend all year here. He travels to Washington, D.C., and he goes to other places doing church work. Some were jealous of his influence with the government. He was a personal friend to 3 presidents and visited frequently at the White House. He addressed Congress many times. And there was one time when he and the President of the United States were on stage at Carnegie Hall. He got around. He had connections. His confidence probably bordered on arrogance sometimes. He opposed tearing down a school for a road to go through. Jackson was put in jail. Several jurors were Russians who didn't speak a word of English. A federal judge said, "Everything they say about him is true, but they say the same things about me. And Jackson is one of the best forces in all of Alaska." All of the charges against Jackson were dismissed with prejudice, which meant that they could not be brought up again. Similarly, Jackson was in trouble with some church officials who complained that he was diverting disproportionate funds to Alaska at the expense of other missions. His defenders pointed out that while some people sat in offices pondering the niceties of administration, Jackson had been on the firing line with his sleeves rolled up, winning souls to God. A group of women published a pamphlet that was widely distributed. Quote, "In unflagging dedication to God's work from Colorado to Arizona to Montana to Alaska, with yearly returns to Washington to instruct Congress, he traveled more than 1,000,000 miles using every known form of transportation, including his own feet. He organized from scratch more than 70 congregations for whom he personally built more than 40 church buildings. He often gave 4 or 5 speeches in a day for a total that ran into many thousands. And church organizations launched by him collected for missionary and other religious work a proved total of $20,364,475. In the work of the Lord he was tireless, and we shall not soon see his like." One of the things he got in trouble for was he got a job with the post office department. And he established postal routes through Alaska, but he also felt that he had the authority, and he had the authority to rename villages and post offices. And he started naming villages after his relatives, his church sponsors, and the one that really did him in, the largest village in Alaska at that time was Houcan, and he named it Jackson. The uproar was terrible. It went to Washington. They ordered the village renamed back to Houcan. Then the Republicans went back in the White House, and they moved it back to Jackson. And eventually the Postal Department said, no, it's going to stay Houcan. I tried to find it on the map. It doesn't exist anymore. All that fuss over nothing. In summer of 1890, Jackson visited the settlements of Arctic Alaska for the purpose of establishing schools. He found that the sources of food supply were diminishing so rapidly that the natives would soon be reduced to misery and slow starvation. On one island, he found the entire population had starved to death. Along the entire coast, the white man's improved methods of slaughter had taken all the whales, walruses, and seals beyond the reach of the native people. He wrote that to establish schools among starving people would be of very little service. The native Eskimos on the Siberian side of the Bering Strait had an unfailing food supply in their large herds of domestic reindeer. Introducing reindeer into the hundreds of thousands of square miles of moss-covered tundra would make those useless wastes conducive to wealth and prosperity of the United States. Using statistics from Lapland, Jackson estimated that Alaska could support over 9 million reindeer. To take a barbarian people on the verge of starvation and lift them up to a comfortable self-support and civilization is certainly a work of national importance. The Commissioner of Education referred the suggestion to the Secretary of the Interior. It came before the 51st Congress in 1890-91, in a bill calling for an appropriation of $15,000. Congress adjourned without taking action. But Jackson was not to be stalled. Dr. Jackson got approval from the Commissioner of Education to solicit private contributions. The appeal was published in newspapers in New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, Washington, D.C., and many church papers across the nation. $2,145 was raised and was used to purchase items for barter, as the Siberian Eskimos had no currency. Well, it's not just getting items. You have to find something that they want, that they'll trade with you. He had his hands full. The Secretary of the Interior gave the authorization to introduce a small number of reindeer into Alaska. The many and perplexing details at times seemed insuperable. Jackson persevered, and with help from the Navy ship, the United States, he made it to Siberia. He had to negotiate around a native superstition against selling living reindeer. He was also warned that the deer might not survive a sea voyage, and that the Alaskan natives might just kill them when they arrived, or that their dogs might kill and eat the deer. It was necessary to test their seaworthiness and protect the reindeer from being eaten upon arrival. Captain Healy on the ship named Bear transported Dr. Jackson 1,500 miles up and down the Siberian coast to bargain with the native leaders and make arrangements to produce reindeer for the next season. On August 16th of 1891, at Iskan village, 4 reindeer were purchased alive and were hoisted onto the ship. They arrived at Unalaska 5 weeks later on September 21st, trembling, hobbled, and bruised, but alive. Jackson returned to Washington, where the Honorable H.M. Teller, the senator from Colorado, drafted a bill appropriating $15,000 to be expended under the direction of the Secretary of the Interior for the purpose of introducing and maintaining reindeer for domestic purposes in Alaska. The bill was approved by the Senate in May. Adverse elements caused the House of Representatives to take no action on the bill. Dr. Jackson returned to Amakak Island and found all 4 reindeer had thrived, and there were several fawns in the herd. Jackson set off to find a location for establishing a station to establish the reindeer enterprise. On June 29th of 1893, an American flag was raised near Cape Spencer at the head of Port Clarence. In honor of the Colorado senator, the facility was named Teller Reindeer Station. Carpenters from the Bear, the ship, delivered lumber and built a house and 2 in-ground shelters. 5 trips to Siberia brought more reindeer. The first arrived at Teller Station July 4th, 1892. 53 head of deer, and 4 Siberian herders came. On the second trip, 2 anchor chains broke, and the ship was held fast in ice for a full week. Fog and drifting ice and heavy surf challenged the ship constantly, but the crew demonstrated a degree of heroism and dogged persistency that has seldom been surpassed. March 3rd, 1893, Congress appropriated $6,000 to purchase additional animals. 27 animals died that winter, but 79 fawns were born in the spring. 127 more deer were imported. Herders were imported from Lapland, and the number of losses was greatly reduced. During the winter of 1892-93, 12 deer were trained to draw sleds. 2 teams made a trip to Cape Prince of Wales, 60 miles from Teller Station. In stops along the way at several villages, the teams were exposed to about 200 dogs. None of the reindeer was molested while tied to picket posts at night outdoors. In September 1893, the herd at Teller Station numbered 346. 119 were taken to Cape Prince of Wales, where a Congregationalist mission had a school. Young men were recruited to become herdsmen for the reindeer enterprise. In 1902, the expected importation of 300 reindeer was thwarted, and only 30 animals were imported from Siberia because the Russian government banned exporting reindeer. The grand total of reindeer imported to Alaska from Siberia was 1,280. Mission schools throughout Alaska trained herders. The government established reindeer stations to expand the number of animals, and the government stations used 3 times as much money to support their stations as the mission schools did. Dog sleds were severely limited in how far they could travel because they had to carry their own food. Reindeer found their own food along the way by uncovering moss under the snow. Reindeer could haul hundreds of pounds an unlimited distance and go through deeper snow. They had longer legs. Senate document 204, given by Captain C.L. Cooper. Quote, the reindeer furnished their owners with food, clothing, and shelter, and nearly all the necessities of life. The flesh, blood, and entrails are eaten. Before reindeer were introduced, Eskimos had no source of milk in their diet. The skin makes garments, beds, and tents. The skin of the leg, which is covered with short hair, makes the boots. From the antlers are made many of their implements, drill bows for lighting fires, knife handles, etc. The sinews of the deer make excellent thread. The bones, soaked in oil, are burned for fuel. The deer provides transportation and motivates the owner to productive use of his time. Pride of ownership assists in developing good character. And thus, introduction of domesticated reindeer has opened new avenues of commerce and travel all over the vast stretches of ice and snow, furnished a new food supply to a starving people, and has developed new industries of exceedingly practical character, and is rapidly solving the problems of the perpetuation and civilization of the Eskimos in our great northern possessions. It has been said in truth that if Dr. Jackson had done no other thing than this, his name would deserve the praise of all lovers of humanity. Afterwards, you can come up and look at some of these pictures. In October of 1897, reliable information reached Washington, D.C. that 8 whaling ships with 300 men on board were icebound off Point Barrow. That's the very northern tip of Alaska. And whaling ships were important because there were no electric lights yet. Whale oil was the fuel for lighting all of our homes and so on. President McKinley called Sheldon Jackson and said, "Is there any way to rescue those men?" Jackson sent Lieutenants D.H. Jarvis and E.P. Berthoff on a voluntary expedition, taking 435 deer, a distance of 800 miles. That's like from here to Savannah, Georgia, only through snow. All of the herders were Eskimos trained at a mission school at Adasarluk. 245 deer were slaughtered and sustained the sailors until they were able to leave. President McKinley praised the rescuers in an address to Congress. A permanent reindeer station was established at Point Barrow, anticipating that the same thing could happen in the future. Sheldon Jackson was Commissioner of Education for the Alaska Territory. He traveled extensively throughout the territory, allotting resources and encouraging teachers and students. On one trip, he was in a sled pulled by young deer being trained to pull sleds. A Lap herder was leading each of the 2 deer. They came upon a gully and the deer jumped to the other side, dumping Jackson who did a double backward somersault and landed in a bush, unable to preserve any semblance of dignity. A close friend said, "I won't tell anyone, Sheldon, but were you able to control your language to reflect your position as the moderator of the National Assembly of the Presbyterian Church?" Jackson replied, "I assure you I was bereft of air to frame any speech at all." In 1899, Jackson secured a contract to deliver mail in Alaska via a reindeer route that was 1,240 miles long. So they really were improving everything. In 16 years, the reindeer population had increased to 18,000. A report in the Presbyterian magazine said, "Church and school worked together to transform the starving, dying Eskimos into well-fed, self-supporting, and self-respecting American citizens." Dr. Tunis Hamlin, Church of the Covenant in New York City, wrote, "I regard Dr. Jackson as the hero par excellence of our frontier religious life. His courage, faith, and persistence are remarkable. He has statesmanlike grasp, and in the matter of reindeer has made good against the cavil of leading public men." Jackson published a national newsletter that was printed in Denver. He was a prolific diarist and writer, so he started Home Mission magazine, which was published in New York City. His diaries, sermons, correspondence, scrapbooks, photos, and personal library were given to the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia. Additional correspondence is housed in Princeton Theological Seminary, and during his years in Alaska, Jackson collected thousands of pieces of native tools, clothing, and craft items. It was policy at that time from the government to erase native cultures. It was believed that if you got rid of their culture, they would be assimilated and become good Americans. Jackson saw that he wanted to preserve the historical heritage of the three civilizations: Inuit,
Tlingit?
Yeah, I'm not saying it right. Thank you. And Aleut. 3,000 pieces are at the museum in Sitka, Alaska, that he collected. That building is located on the campus of Sheldon Jackson College. And that building is on the National Registry of Historic Buildings as the first concrete structure erected in Alaska. Jackson did not establish that college. It was named for him in honor. It operated from 1878 to 2007. And again, it's there as a museum, and there are pictures of it right there on the wall. In 1903, Jackson's health forced him to leave the rigorous life in Alaska and do office work for the church in Washington, D.C., and be near his doctors. His lifelong internal distresses became disabling. He had a series of surgeries. I don't know how many or what they involved, but he was in tough shape. In May of 1909, Jackson was planning a trip to Denver to attend the Presbyterian General Assembly. He also wanted to visit friends and to visit some of the chapels he had built in Colorado. 3 weeks before the trip, he died in Asheville, North Carolina. He died 16 days shy of his 75th birthday and 1 year after his wife had passed. He is buried in the Chuctanunda Cemetery, south of Minaville on New York 30, with his wife and their 3 daughters, in a separate plot from his parents and sister, because I went to find the grave and I couldn't find his. I only found his father and mother. But it's there, and it's easy to find. You just have to keep looking. These days, Jackson is faulted for requiring the natives to attend schools that used only English. That was the law at that time. He had no control over that. Jackson saved thousands of natives from starvation, from Oklahoma to Point Barrow. He showed them respect and compassion and worked hard against cultural prejudice against them. His tireless dedication to God and goodness promoted unity among Congress, the Presbyterians, other Christian churches, settlers of many ethnicities, and tribal leaders of many tribes to cooperate for the benefit of common people. And I am proud to give this presentation about a local son who did us proud. I have my sources here. This book, on the cover, it says, "This work has been selected by scholars as being culturally important and is part of the knowledge base of civilization as we know it. This work is in the public domain of the United States of America and possibly other nations. Within the United States, you may freely copy and distribute this work as no entity has a copyright on the body of the work. Scholars believe, and we concur, that this particular work is important enough to be preserved, reproduced, and made generally available to the public. We appreciate your support of the preservation process and thank you for being an important part of keeping this knowledge alive." I lost my book, so I bought another one. And the old one was photocopied from an old book, and it had all kinds of marks in the margin and everything. The second copy's been cleaned up. I learned a bit about him in Michener's book, Alaska. Over 40 pages of just Sheldon Jackson. Really good information there. And of course I went online, and there's lots of stuff here about his wife, his father, his grandfathers, and so on. I have some pictures. Oh, this suit is made of fur, and he wore a beard because he said it made him look taller. He was only 5 feet tall. A tiny little guy. And some people say he was shorter than that. He just said he was 5 feet tall. In one questionnaire, he claimed to be 5'4". But everybody said there's no way he was that tall. So anyway, short in stature, but so grand in accomplishment. And just, there were so many stories in these books that I would have loved to tell you. They're colorful, they are heartrending, they are inspiring. And he grew up right here on the road between Esperance and,
You said Minaville.
Bremen Corners, yes. It goes down toward the creek at Martinsville. And he lived there. And they tell me the house is still up. I've been up there twice. I can't recognize it. But they tell me it's still there. So I'm going to keep looking. Any questions? Yes?
In what you read, was there any reference to whether his wife accompanied him?
Yes. She did very often. But he normally, he settled her and the girls. They had 3 daughters. And he would go off and then come back. And when he went back to Washington, she went along, yes.
Wow, yeah,
and she was a tremendous missionary in her own right. Yes. Yes, sir.
When did the reindeer learn to fly?
That would have been in 1951 when Gene Autry was singing about that. Okay, yes.
It's astounding to think that just one man did all of that.
That's right.
Yeah.
He was just incredibly productive. And everybody who met him credited him with being a fabulous orator. And he must have been. He talked people into doing all kinds of stuff, And, wow.
And because I live on Sheldon Road, I'm curious as to whether he had any connection to the naming of that.
I am curious also because my father grew up on Sheldon Road. So, I'm sure there's a connection somewhere, but I don't know how many cousins or uncles were involved. I don't know.
Nothing direct.
No, I wouldn't know how to find out how Sheldon Road got its name. Anybody? No. Okay. You're welcome to come up and look at these things, and definitely look at the pictures. And yeah, this is Mrs. Jackson, Miss Voorhees, and that's Sheldon in 1880, and that's Sheldon Jackson College over there. Okay.
Thank you. Oh, that was wonderful.